Hi there, this is going to be a comprehensive video about my Vanda care on my windowsill. I've been growing Vandas on the windowsill since 2011, that's 8 years now, and overall I'm quite happy with the results I got, although at this point I'm getting into trouble because they're growing so fast. I'll talk about my growing conditions, baskets, pots and media, watering, sharing water, misting, fertilizing including TDS values, pH adjusting, removing Keikis and dealing with infected or rootless Vandas. I've seen many videos about Vanda care and seen it change 1 or 2 years later again, but most of the care routines that I'm talking about in this video are what I've practiced for many years now and that have proven to be effective. I went through the comments I got on my Vanda videos and I'm going to try to answer as many of them as possible. Sometimes I will refer to a video that I've already made because some of them are quite in-depth already. And before we're getting started, I'd like to draw your attention to our app. Please check out our iPhone application called Orchid Collection to keep track of your orchids. Link in the description box. And now let's get right into the video. For me, efficiency is key. I simplified my Vanda care as best as I could, but as you can see they don't suffer and I didn't have to give up enjoying their beautiful flowers. In this first part, I'll talk about my growing space, pots, baskets and growing medium, and my watering and misting routine. So let's get started. First of all, some general remarks on my growing space so that you can see under what conditions my care routines actually work. Because the more similar your growing conditions are to mine, the more likely it is that my growing methods might suit you as well. I'm living in Central Europe, that means we have 4 seasons, hot, dry and bright summers and cold, wet and dark winters, and something in between, spring and autumn. My windowsills are south facing, I grow my Vandas indoors all year round without any shading. For air movement I open the balcony door a couple of times per day. I don't have fans though. Temperatures range between 17 and 27 degrees Celsius. 17, that's in cold winter nights, and sometimes it's hotter than 27 in hot summer weeks, and about 20 to 22 degrees in autumn and spring. The humidity is about 50 to 65%, mostly somewhere in between. I grow all my Vandas in baskets and pots. Wherever I could fit some coarse bark in between the roots I did so, but some, like my biggest Vanda, are just bare-rooted. You might want to check out my video in which I repotted this large Vanda. It had been sitting in its old basket for 6 years. The baskets I use are bought second-hand or are handmade from discarded tropical wood, which seemed to be left over when someone built their terrace. Someone asked how I get to keep all the roots inside the basket so that they do not come out here and there. Here's a picture before and after, a little root maintenance obsession. That's so funny. I wanted to say session. Okay, sorry. We'll go on. Most of the time they attach themselves to the basket on their own. Sometimes I try to guide them a bit. Sometimes they grow straight into the room and break off eventually, because I run into them. About watering. You might want to watch my watering videos for more details. I tried to find a routine that suits my needs and I was lucky that the Vandas are more or less happy with it. I don't have a rigid schedule though. Sometimes I water once a week, sometimes twice a month depending on my workload. I try to be more diligent with watering when spikes are developing or the plant is a little more needy because it's new in my collection, it's a young plant, it doesn't have many roots or so. But at the moment all my Vandas are pretty well established on my windowsill, so I'm all about simplifying my care routines. I soak the Vandas in baskets a few hours in the evening or overnight, let them drip dry during nighttime or in the early morning and hang them up in the morning. The roots stay green for a couple of hours and silvery for the rest of the week, but that doesn't automatically mean that it needs water again. I've done an experiment where I soaked a Vanda for 24 hours. The experiment started out in a state of moderate dehydration and the plant was able to soak up almost a liter of water. It wouldn't be able to soak up a liter of water 4 times a week though, because the roots would still be quite saturated from the last soak, although they do look silvery 95% of the time. Soaking overnight works really well for me, but I'd recommend starting slowly to avoid root tip damage. I've never really experienced it myself, but some people in the comment section mentioned root tip damage in smaller roots when over soaking. And what about my potted Vandas? About a year ago I changed my watering routine to bottom watering. In the past I placed them in a decorative pot with water and soaked them for a couple of hours, one after another. They liked it, but it was quite much of a hassle, and I postponed watering so that they stayed dry for quite some time between the waterings. So far, they do enjoy this more consistent way of watering. And yes, water is being shared between some of the potted Vandas and some of the Vandas in baskets. But that's a risk I'm willing to take for the benefit of a very time-saving watering routine. And I'm quite careful when I introduce a new plant into my collection. You see the plant on the left-hand side? It's fairly new. I bought it in March this year, and it's being watered separately in an extra tray. About misting? I don't mist my Vandas because of mainly two reasons. Firstly, I've never had much luck with my spraying bottles. They were leaking, losing water when not handled properly, and so on. And it would be quite much of a hassle to wipe up all the droplets of water I lose. And second, but most important, I don't mist my Vandas because it's not an efficient, time-saving way of watering for me. Spraying doesn't get much water into the plant. Every once in a while I shower my Vandas completely to freshen up their leaves and aerial roots though. But not very often, maybe twice a year. About fertilizing. If you didn't know already, I'm not really well versed in fertilizing, but I will tell you how I do it. I have buckets of water in my bathtub in which I mix water and fertilizer. Since I don't water my Vandas all too often, the water stays in there for a couple of weeks, which isn't optimal. And here's why. I've never had trouble with nasty germs in the water. It stays surprisingly fresh for quite a long time. At least it doesn't smell bad. I change it when it's getting unsightly. About a year ago I got myself a pH meter and found out that the pH in my buckets alters quite a bit when the water is getting old. Too low or too high of a pH, less nutrient absorption. Too low of a pH, less phosphorus absorption. And as far as I know, phosphorus is important for building blooms. Please check out the link in the description box where Dustin talks about pH adjusting on his blog Here But Not. There's a very helpful chart regarding the pH relation of nutrient absorption and critical thoughts on the correct, best or ideal pH for watering orchids. I don't know what caused these alterations in my buckets. Maybe some of the fertilizer compounds formed precipitations. I began adjusting the pH with sodium bicarbonate and pH down. My pH meter helped me to avoid extreme pH alterations. I have to mention that I didn't get too meticulous about it though, and I began to use CalMac at the same time. But either way, my blue Vanda bloomed again for the very first time in 3 years, and I was so happy to see more than just leaves on this large Vanda again. Someone asked if I fertilize even during blooming. Yes, I do. I fertilize in low quantities most of the time, regardless of the season or what the plant is doing. But sometimes I don't mix in fertilizer and the Vandas don't get any fertilizer for a couple of weeks. I'll put the concentrations of the fertilized water somewhere on the screen. They could take much more, but that's about what I went for the last couple of years. And having the pH meter, I noticed that higher concentrations of fertilizer are more difficult to manage pH-wise, so I stick with the lower end. Some have been asking which fertilizer I use, but I don't want to promote a certain brand, and I'm quite convinced that fertilizer isn't the key to successful Vanda growing, since I've been using different fertilizers during the last couple of years without noting any differences that I would attribute to a certain brand of fertilizer. About Keikis. Many of my Vandas do have quite a lot of Keikis. It can be a sign that something is wrong in the crown or the stem, but in fact all my big ones started growing Keikis at some point because that's just what they do at a certain size and age. I've never removed a Keiki from the mother plants. I always leave them attached because I like the bushy growth pattern, and more plants mean more workload and taking more space, and it would have been more stressful for the mother plant than just leave them be. Dealing with Vandas whose stem is infected is tough, and I've made a video where I talked about how I managed to save some Vandas with a fungal infection in the stem. I've mostly seen brown and black tissue in infected Vanda stems. It's extremely important to intervene decisively if a Vanda has stem rot and get rid of the infected tissue reliably. I wouldn't feel safe leaving infected tissue in the plant because I doubt the infection would stop on its own. I've experienced that as soon as an infection gets visible, it's so advanced that the plant cannot deal with it on its own. That's why I always went with cutting the stem. Also, I'm not a fan of fungicides because of their toxic effects on humans, animals and the environment. That's why I try to avoid them as much as possible. I'm trying to reduce the chemical load that I'm exposed to as best as I can, including toxic household cleaners. Vinegar does a great job in most occasions. I have still some fungicides and pesticides for emergencies, but for me there's a difference between precious plants very close to my heart that I've had for many years and plants that I haven't had for a long time. I wouldn't take any risks and introduce a sick plant from the grocery store into my collection. I wouldn't want to use toxic chemicals to try to save them either. It wouldn't be worth any risk for me. I got many questions by people having sick Vandas and it's really difficult to answer them. Firstly, because I don't see and experience the plants firsthand. And secondly, I'm certainly not all-knowing. What I can say is that I would toss a plant away if the infection has taken over most of the plant. But if there's still a lot left and you really want to give it a try, please don't water this plant together with others and consider making a cut to get rid of the affected part. If the top is sick and the bottom is healthy, just cut the top, keep the bottom and wait and see. One of the affected Vandas I had ended up being rootless because I had to cut the stem, but I managed to nurse it back to health. If I remember correctly, I sprayed the leaves every once in a while, but I don't know how effective that even was. The plant did recover without much assistance. I hung it up beside the window so that the sun wouldn't contribute to drying it out further. It took a few months and the leaves became a bit papery with time, but less than I would have expected. At some point new roots appeared and I watered them on a daily basis. Miss Orchid Girl has made 2 very informative videos on nursing orchids with very few roots back to health that I will link in the description box below. There are infections, I would say mostly bacterial infections, that are quite easily manageable by just cutting the leaves or the leaf tips. But this particular one that you see here was not so easily manageable. I needed to cut the leaves and treat it with a fungicide because it wouldn't stop on its own. I link a video that I have made. Bless you. And I link a video that I have made on this particular infection in the description box below. Little black spots on Vanda leaves can be Philosticta, and compared to other infections I experienced, this wasn't a disaster. I've tried different treatments that didn't really help. In case you're interested, I can make a separate video on it. But I guess the infection never took over because the spores seem to need water to germinate and infect new tissue, and my plants rarely get wet on the outside. Providing optimal conditions can prevent most diseases. But a windowsill will never be a year-round perfect environment for growing tropical plants. Dr. Mote says in a short article about Philosticta, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And that's absolutely true. I think prevention should mean trying to provide the best possible conditions, high light, air movement, proper hygiene, and to react quickly if something shows up. Preventive sprayings with fungicides of the whole collection every 4 to 6 weeks, beginning in May, like Dr. Motes is suggesting, is not an option for me, for different reasons, even though it might be effective. During the last couple of years, I've had very few problems that I could have prevented with such a regime though, so that's not really convincing for me in my case, but I can understand that it might be suitable for a nursery or in a greenhouse. Dr. Motes definitely knows what he's talking about. but we simply have different growing conditions. I think there are huge differences in the collections, growing spaces and growing habits on YouTube. So I think we should keep that in mind when we are searching for advice that's suitable for our Vandas. Okay, I hope you got something out of this video. Please let me know how you grow your Vandas and if you are happy with it. And if you are still watching, I'm not on Facebook or anywhere else on social media, so you could do me a huge favor and share my video with someone who might be interested so that more people find my videos. That would be really much appreciated. Thanks a lot for watching and let me know if you have any further questions. Happy growing to all of you. Bye bye!